Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 21st week of 2018. I'm Carl Estabrook, described by liberal colleagues this week as 1, a scoundrel, 2, a pathological liar, and 3, not a true green. So be careful what you listen to tonight from me.
That's referring to the Green Party, of course.
Yes. Yeah, you're a true green for something else.
I'm a true green.
You're a real true green.
Yeah.
Since 1990, I've apparently been annoying liberal comrades in a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, first on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube. Earlier editions of this program are available at archive.org. Our program's name, News from Neptune, comes from Noam Chomsky. He's been writing sensible things about U.S. politics for twice as long as we've been on the air. Chomsky says in the U.S. media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Tonight, David Green and I will try to say some true things with thanks to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, for research. No's notes are posted on the News from Neptune Facebook page. We try to bear in mind the murdered Rosa Luxemburg's remark from a century ago. The most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening. This is a King's Evil Advisors edition of News from Neptune. What I had in mind here was the pre-modern tendency of politics in Europe to suggest that evils in society were the result of the kings being badly advised. The king himself was somehow removed from this consideration as being the source of justice. That's what he was supposed to do, after all, and suggest that he was being misadvised by people who produced the bad effects in society. This didn't always work. Both the English and the French cut heads off kings who decided that it was not just the evil advisors who were doing it. But the parallel occurs to me as we have seen President Trump this week decide not to carry out his meeting with the head of North Korea. That's the head he lost, I guess. And clearly, as a result of his evil advisors, the neocons, Pence, Bolton, the others around him.
Pompeo.
Oh, Pompeo, yes, exactly. Who are suggesting that the summit meeting not take place. This is a King's Evil Advisors edition of News from Neptune, and we'll start with David Green, clearly a true green, and I did think of the lawn company at the time.
Carl, just in case you're not having a good game today, I brought in Joe Madden, the manager of the Chicago Cubs, and he'll pull you out.
Oh, good. That's right.
If you're, he may have to send in a relief pitcher.
Sent to the showers?
Yeah, so we'll see how it goes. I know there's a lot of controversy. I personally don't think it's a controversy about a whole lot, because although I did look up the polling data for what little polling data there has been for the Davis-Lonergan matchup, the Davis-Lonergan smackdown in District 13, and it actually did. Apparently, there were some polls a month or two ago that showed Davis only leading by like 3%.
I saw that, yes.
And I don't know why it is that when you see lists of districts that might flip, the Illinois 13th is never on that. Maybe they just haven't caught up with that polling data yet. But we'll see how things go. We'll see whether it matters, in whatever way, how it is when November comes, whether my vote or your vote for Lonergan or Davis or some write-in candidate or Donald Duck actually matters.
If it can be possibly construed in an interesting way, I mean, I think most of the local debate about it really is pretty trivial. The question is whether we want to flip the control of the House of Representatives from the Republicans, where it is right now, to the Democrats. And most good liberals think that, of course, that's the thing to do. I have my doubts about that, and that's what I've been saying. That's what I've been suggesting by saying we we shouldn't send a Democrat to the House of Representatives. But the issue, it reminds me of the old question about why academic politics are so vicious. The answer being because so little is at stake. And it seems to me that that's true also in the discussion of what happens to the congressional seat from the 3rd Illinois Congressional District.
And therein lies the problem as to why you might not make it out of the fourth inning of this show. And you've got to get 5 innings to get credit for the victory.
That's exactly right.
Or loss, as the case may be if you are a starting pitcher in baseball. For those of you who don't know about baseball,
I think I'll take the Celtics as my model.
Okay, all right. Anyway, I have a couple of things that I would just like to point out. First of all, there were several people. It seemed to be a bad week for people dying, not just in wars, but I mentioned 3 well-known people, all happened to be Jewish men who died at advanced ages of natural causes. One was Richard Pipes, a Russia scholar who probably wouldn't be known so well anymore, except for that his son Daniel Pipes, a Islamophobe of the first order, has been still holding forth. Daniel's about my age, I think, and his father lived to be into his 90s. His father, Richard Pipes, was a Russophobe in the Harvard political science or history department of many years, and part of the reason why we've been able to maintain this Cold War mentality, certainly probably not a major reason or a fundamental reason. Excuse me. The other person, one of the other people of note to die was Bernard Lewis. And Bernard Lewis, who lived to be over 101, was also in a sort of related ilk. Bernard Lewis is actually credited, or actually did, coin the phrase class of civilizations, which was later more identified with Samuel Huntington. But Huntington did, as it turns out, credit Bernard Lewis, who was a classicist, probably a good classicist. I'm not sure how you feel about that, who probably might have better stayed in the classics field as opposed to branching out in the sort of Orientalist studies that led him to be such an Islamophobe in relation to understanding what it was the Muslims' problem was. The phrase that's most associated with him was the title of an article in the Atlantic Monthly, "The Roots of Muslim Rage." Would that have been the 1980s or 90s? I'm not sure.
Probably, yeah.
But anyway, a lot of mischief was done in a kind of intellectual arena. Lewis taught at Princeton, whereas Pipes taught at Harvard. The other person I'm thinking of, Philip Roth, didn't teach. Well, maybe he did teach at some point somewhere, but kind of a worthy of note. I've never been a huge fan of Philip Roth, but that's because I just didn't put the time in to read his later work, so I don't have a view on Philip Roth. But it's interesting to read what kind of life he had and what his explorations in white Jewish maleness, where those led him in terms of his inner creative life and the controversies that ensued from that. And then, of course, the other person, and maybe you have a comment about this because I don't, Tom Wolfe.
Oh, yes.
I didn't read his stuff. I tend to not have read the Tom Wolfe, the Hunter Thompsons, the whatever. I tend not to have read those kinds of people. and Tom Wolfe, of course.
And you lived in California. How could you not?
I don't know. Because I was actually living.
I get. You didn't have to read about it. Those of us on the East Coast had to read about it, right?
I'm too boring and too serious to have read Tom Wolfe or Hunter Thompson. But Tom Wolfe in his later years became identified with the more conservative sort of a backlash from the earlier drug hazed era that he was part of in relation to Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters and all that. And I do like
Right.
Ken Kesey, but I don't know whether you had a Tom Wolfe comment before we moved on.
I don't think you're allowed into California if you don't like Ken Kesey, right? I mean,
Well,
they
no,
stop you at the border,
right? I
Yeah.
think. Well, that wasn't why I left, but it would have been a good reason, perhaps.
See. Yeah, I have one comment on Tom Wolfe, a minor one. The other people that you talked about also are worth some comment, I think. But Tom Wolfe, there's a wonderfully dismissive piece about Wolfe that I will post on the Facebook page of News from Neptune. His last fling was particularly odd and has reference to our spiritual presence here at News from Neptune, Noam Chomsky, in that the last book he wrote was an attack on Chomsky's linguistics. The fact that he didn't know anything about Chomsky's linguistics did not deter him. And he wrote this very strange things about how Chomsky's notions of linguistics can't be right. Well, if it meant that people actually learned what Chomsky's notions of linguistics actually were, given the fact that Noam Chomsky did for the science and philosophy of language roughly what Albert Einstein did for physics in the 20th century. That's all to the good. But it was a peculiar sort of attack, and some people tried to sort out what it had to do with the reactionary politics that he had spoken of all along, but I'm not sure it was worth the effort. In any case, if it's
Did he attack the idea, the basic Chomskyan
Yes.
idea that language is an innate process that can't possibly explain by the actual stimulus in a sort of behaviorist sense?
exactly. That's what he did,
And Wolfe, of all people,
exactly.
doesn't accept that?
He doesn't accept that, and there is a point there having to do with Chomsky's notion of language, which suggests the uniqueness of human nature. And I think perhaps if we went digging long enough, if we wanted to, we could find, as I say, a political or social prejudice in Wolfe that made him not want to accept that. Chomsky has always claimed that his politics and his science, the language work and his amazing record of commentary on American politics over 60 years and more, have really nothing to do with each other. He said the only thing that politics did was keep him away from doing the scientific work that he wanted to do. There are a lot of people who do doubt that, and they suggest that the Chomskyan notion of human nature underlies the ethical basis of his own political views. But that's maybe not terribly important. Much more important is what he said in both areas. And if some of that should ignite an oddball like Wolfe, okay, let it play out. Some other points that I wanted to mention. You touched on a number of people and a number of institutions that we actually have been talking about this week. Philip Roth, I remember reading shortly after it came out, I think, Letting Go. Roth was about 10 years my senior, I guess, but it was an account of sort of young manhood and graduate school, marriage and family and so forth, that I found remarkably insightful. I thought it was quite good. I was quite taken with it, and went off to read other Roth novels as they came out, and had a similar experience with John Updike, liking the early stuff and then being put off by where the mature author went. Calling Philip Roth a mature author may be a mistake, but that's another matter. I thought the best description of Roth came in Haaretz, where they referred to him as the Yid with an id, that having mainly to do mainly to do with Portnoy's complaint, which actually probably made his recommendation, and it's an absolutely awful novel. It goes on from there to the political novels that he did late in life, notably the one celebrating, in inverted commas, a Charles Lindbergh-like candidate in the Charles Lindbergh candidacy in an alternate history of the run-up to the Second World War. As I say, progressively awful as he grew older and produced quite a large body of work, no question about that. Bernard Lewis and Richard Pipes raise questions that we have been debating online and elsewhere this week about what Noam Chomsky referred to as the Academy for the Passive and Obedient in Harvard Square. He's referring to Harvard University and its peculiar place in the American politics and history. The important note, as a victim of that of the history department of that institution, I was given Bernard Lewis to read in my first readings about the Middle East. I'm old enough, and he's even older. He was even older, so that that was possible. The Harvard history department had a very bad reputation. That was not known by outsiders because Harvard dines out on its reputation. Richard Pipes, an awful, as you say, Russophobe, was an example of the horrid politics of that department. There were others in that institution. When the anti-war student demonstrations occurred at Harvard in 1969, the history department was one of the major objects of their objection, precisely because it was so reactionary. And that's, I can testify that that was indeed the case. I will mention, and that's just a bit self-indulgent, that there was one bright spot. Harvard in those days decided that they had to produce a sort of Eastern civilization department parallel to the Western civilization department, or courses that were common in the American Academy in the 20th century. Those terms were not used at Harvard, but what they did do is go out and get major Asian scholars, of course, white men from America, but Asian scholars, and like most of the Asian scholars of that generation, they were often the scions of missionary families that had been in East Asia when they were young. John K. Fairbank and Edward Reischauer taught a famous course at Harvard on Eastern civilization, the civilization of China, Japan, and Korea. And I was a beneficiary of that, too. A friend of mine said, oh, we should go look at that. We did, and I was quite taken with it and learned a great deal from it. I was also introduced to the most remarkable scholar at Harvard in those days in this area, Bernard Schwartz. Schwartz wrote in 1951, Schwartz, who was trained as a Romance language specialist, taught himself Chinese, got some of these documents that were coming out of East Asia after the Chinese Revolution, and wrote in 1951, Chinese Communism and the Rise of Mao, still the best account of how of the career of Mao Zedong. I was much taken with Schwartz, took up courses from him, never managed to learn Chinese, but that's my failure. The account of this event was particularly important, even though one didn't realize it at that time. In many ways, the Chinese Revolution, what was called in American politics for many years the loss of China, as if we had China and we lost it, there's an importance in that in that phrase, was the greatest reversal of American foreign policy in the 20th century. More important than the war in the Pacific, more important than the open door policy, whereby the U.S. established economic control over East Asia for the benefit of the American 1% in the first half, or in the late 19th and early 20th century. The fall of China, the loss of China, the success of the Chinese Revolution was the turning point for American foreign policy, and in many ways of domestic politics as well. The whole McCarthy business is not understandable without the soul-searching is not the right word, the constant blaming that went on in American politics over this disaster. So they were interesting times to be an undergraduate and to listen to the people who were just barely doing some things about this matter. But the Harvard History Department was notoriously bad, full of Cold Warriors and so forth, and the only bright spot was their East Asian contingent. So that was then, this is now. Where do we go from here?
Well, let me continue on. I think it's an appropriate segue. At the risk of having a show that's talking exclusively about white men and mostly Jewish men, we'll soldier on here because I think we've been trying to address some issues related to populism, to the aforementioned McCarthyism and populism and so forth. And I recalled, I read a few years ago a book by Michael Rogan that challenges what the conventional wisdom was about populism. And to review that briefly, I know we've mentioned this a few times on this program in the past, but our understandings of late 19th century populism after World War II were shaped by a very important book by a very good historian, Richard Hofstadter, called The Age of Reform in 1955. And since then, and that's just one of those books that you got to read because you've got to read it to understand how it shaped not just the historical world, but the world of political commentary and punditry and so forth ever since. His essay, The Paranoid Style, was also in that same vein. That was a few years later, I think in 1961 or 2. And the currently well-regarded political scientist, Corey Robin, took up these issues in March of last year, or March of 2017, in his understanding in his understanding of the early months of the Trump era. And his blog post at that time on Corey Robin's blog, What Michael Rogan Means to Me, Particularly Age of Trump, traditional politics matters. And let me just read a few sentences from here just to give you what the flavor of this is. Though it is less famous and influential than Rogan's later book, Ronald Reagan, the movie,
that's the title of the book.
That's the title of the book. This Michael Rogan's book, The Intellectuals and McCarthy, was a formative text in my own, that is Corey Robin's development. It came at a critical moment in my thinking, either the year before I went to graduate school or in my first year of graduate school, and permanently left its mark. Corey Robin's, I think in his 50s perhaps. In his book on McCarthy, Rogan took aim at historians like Richard Hofstadter and social theorists like Daniel Bell, the dominant sociologist of the 1950s, the dominant liberal sociologist of the 1950s, who had argued that McCarthyism was essentially a form of irrational mass politics, a mid-century American populism that, though right-wing, was the inheritor of left-wing movements like populists or Bob La Follette's movement in the early part of the 20th century. That's Bob La Follette of the Progressive Party in Wisconsin in the early 20th century, father and son. What united all these characters, Hofstadter and Bell argued, was a sense of status anxiety, the social vertigo induced by modern industrial society, which left men and women without that sense of place that they had in traditional forms of society. And then parenthetically, Robin notes, this is a fairly familiar theme in all modern social thought, from Tocqueville to Durkheim to Arendt, from Talcott Parsons to Robert Putnam, just to throw out a few names that are well known. And then it gets this theory, this perspective, according to Robin, gets resurrected every 7 years or so. I don't know where he came up with 7 years or so, as if it were some blazing new insight. But it's been around for centuries. La Follette was, or I think La Follette is what you're supposed to say, was a particularly irresistible precedent for Hofstadter and Bell, because he, like McCarthy, was from Wisconsin. And it was La Follette's son, young Bob La Follette, who McCarthy defeated in the infamous 1946 campaign that propelled McCarthy to the Senate. And there's a couple more sentences. Though through a close analysis of the electoral data, Rogan, in his book about this, took the Hofstadter-Bell thesis apart piece by piece. He showed that McCarthy and La Follette represented two quite different constituencies, that McCarthyism was much more a function of elite politics than mass politics, and that it was driven by quite specific political and economic grievances and issues, and fairly traditional and conventional fissures of party politics, rather than any exotic motivation of free-floating social psychology. And so, what Robin concludes about all this is that I'm dubious. He argues, we forget or toss everything out. I think this is the important sentence. We forget or toss out everything we know about conventional politics and instantly resort to more far-flung notions and categories, fascism, authoritarianism, and the like. This also applies especially to how we analyze political phenomenon like violence. And so he goes on from there. And applies it to his own understanding of Donald Trump and his own understanding of what conservatism is and what populism is, and how those things are playing out in the current era.
I think that both the McCarthy phenomenon and the current arguments about populism illustrate what is in some ways the most important fact in American politics, in the structure of American politics of the last century or so, and that is the imposition of limits of allowable debate. That is, the notion of democracy in America is always hedged about with the idea about, well, you can argue within these areas, but you can't go beyond it. And the current problem in some ways, and in the parallel with McCarthyism a half century ago, is that these movements tend to get outside those limits of allowable debate. Now, once that happens, there are tremendous forces in American society to bring it back in, as it finally pulled down the McCarthy enthusiasm of the post-war period. And that's worthwhile looking at in terms of what was going on there in terms of traditional politics, as you say, and the new enthusiasms that were supposed to be contained within the limits of allowable debate. Now, we're having something similar occur now, where notions variously described as populism threaten to get outside of those limits. Once again, we have an obiter dictum of Noam Chomsky's to deal with here. He said, almost a generation ago now, the smart way to keep people passive and obedient, which after all is the task of the American ruling class in regard to democracy, the smart way to keep people passive and obedient is to strictly limit the spectrum of acceptable opinion, but allow very lively debate within that spectrum. Even encourage the more critical and dissident views. that gives people the sense that there's free thinking going on, while all the time the presuppositions of the system are being reinforced by the limits put on the range of the debate. Close quote. I think that's right. And I think what happens in peculiar occasions, like the McCarthy years and perhaps again today, is that those limits that are imposed so that the argument can go on within them, those limits are breaking. We're having things get outside of that. And the American ruling class is desperately afraid of that and is willing to do an awful lot of things to keep things within the limits of allowable debate. And that is the sort of the structural form of our argument right now. The present situation is in some ways new in that the American 20th century was an exercise in maintaining those limits of allowable debate on a restive population that was largely successful, except for outbreaks like McCarthyism and some other things, but that threatens now not to be able to continue that success, not be able to keep it within the limits of allowable debate. And that's what keeps our rulers up at night. That's what they're worried about. And that's the reason we have foolishness about Russiagate and fake news and so forth, and the need to control the sorts of things that actually say. For the first time since the McCarthy years, we have Americans talking about how political speech has to be suppressed because it's beyond the limits of allowable debate. That's new.
Yeah. A few points just to flesh this out a little bit. The populist era of the late 1800s really wasn't, as far as I understand, wasn't very well studied through that whole era that Hofstadter was writing in. And so people kind of took up that understanding of populism, of this sort of Midwestern, Southern, Western phenomenon. And people didn't really start writing about it seriously till the 1970s, along with all the other things that the new historians started writing seriously about. A fellow named Lawrence Goodwin down at Duke wrote about populism and really changed people's thinking about that. What Hofstadter was drawing on was a very different understanding, and he was exploiting the fact that people didn't know much about populism by identifying populism with throwing in a sort of a bag of things that he identified negatively with populism. Among them, of course, was anti-Semitism. And of course, this came when he said that in the 1950s, post-World War II, that struck perhaps a minor chord. By the 1960s, this was striking a more major chord, and then this whole argument about populism and identifying certain movements with a bad form of populism was ripe in the post-67, the post-Arab Israel War, in which anti-Semitism came to be kind of in the the foreground of liberal understanding of what's going on. Another note would have to do just with the fact that Truman wasn't any less of a Cold Warrior. President Truman wasn't any less of a Cold Warrior than McCarthy himself.
Exactly.
And the Korean War was a much more significant thing than McCarthyism itself.
Absolutely.
And so we have to keep that in mind. And just another little final word about Michael Rogan. What he did in this book about McCarthyism was he actually did political science, and it's political science can be done. It can, I mean, you can use data and charts and graphs and count things in the real world that actually reflect something about the real world. And so what Rogan done in this redemptive political science effort was to actually go back into the records and the polling and the counties and the places that elected McCarthy senator, and find out that it wasn't the working class. It was in fact not a status thing, but a class thing, and that McCarthy didn't represent the people. He didn't represent the so-called deplorable people in the sense that they might have come to be understood since then. So that's just a few comments on rounding that out.
The old line is that political science is to science as military music is to music.
Yes.
And I think that's true. And maybe in terms, it may be a straw in the wind from what we were talking about a moment ago, that the Academy for the Passive and Obedient in Harvard Square doesn't use the term.
Yeah.
What would be called a Department of Political Science elsewhere is called at Harvard a Department of Government. And that is at least a little more honest about what they're doing as they try to conform minds to the ruling class understanding of what government is.
And thus Samuel P. Huntington, the aforementioned
Exactly.
science professor of the science of government,
Science of government.
who made who made Bernard Lewis's class of civilizations.
Yes.
More widely known. But there is those political scientists, those few. Thomas Ferguson, who's did a lot, has again updating our understanding, just as Rogan tried to update our understanding of what elected, McCarthy. Thomas Ferguson, who got kicked out of MIT, Chomsky was one of his advocates at MIT.
Not of kicking him out, but
No,
he
not
was
of
one of
kicking
his
him out.
advocates.
He wanted
right,
him to stay, yeah. But he was kicked out because he was doing political science in a way that it wasn't supposed to be done. But he's had a long paper recently analyzing very accurately what it was. The word Hunger Games is in the title of this paper.
It's not about an actor.
Thomas Ferguson, about what elected Trump, and this is the argument that's been going on ever since Trump got elected. Similar to analogously to why McCarthy was elected in the early the late 40s, and that is what was it economic issues or was it racism? Was it deplorablism with that elected Trump? And we've gone over that. We've covered that ground many times on this program.
You're watching News from Neptune. We're particularly concerned today with the notion of populism. It's worthwhile because the word itself is a scene of struggle, as they say. I would like to suggest that in part because of the history that David was sketching, populism, the best way to use the term populism is to understand that populism is democracy, not the simulacrum of democracy of modern capitalist states, including our own, which are controlled in the interests of an economic elite, the 1%, the ruling class, say what you want. Populism, as its roots in America that David is talking about, shows, is in fact a trust in the people to govern themselves. The word we use for that is democracy, although we've so debased that term by suggesting that the political system in this country is democracy, that it's really not very useful anymore. Populism has to be called into service to describe what happens when people run their own political institutions. We see, and because of that, we see today remarkably tendentious uses of populism to denigrate democratic demands that have slipped out of the control of the political organizations like the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, which are meant to contain them in the interests of the ruling class. That's what those parties are supposed to do. Populist impulses, under this definition, would include both the Sanders and Trump campaigns, would include Brexit and the Corbynistas in Britain, Le Pen and Mélenchon in France, the Lega and N5S, the Five Star Movement, that have just put together a populist government in Italy, and even the AfD in Germany. We spend much effort in trying to divide populist movements into left populism and right populism, because it's so important for the American political structure to have left and right separated and let the battle go on, as Chomsky was describing. But in fact, as the new Italian government shows, that division of left and right populism is largely an attempt to put the populist genie back into the bottle and obscure the fact that populism of the left and populism of the right have much more in common with one another than either have in common with traditional politics, the neoliberal and neoconservative center of politics in contemporary capitalist democracies. I think that's important, and as I say, the Italian example, to everyone's surprise, is showing the way here. There's a tremendous attempt to overcome the populist parties that won the last election in Italy, and to take this government, which has painfully emerged from their conjunction, and force it back into what Tariq Ali calls not the vital center, that's Schlesinger, to force it back into the mold of standard parties, Republicans, Democrats, center-right, center-left, Tory and Labor, so forth and so on. The Italians have broken out of that quite remarkably, and the pressures being brought to bear by the EU and the US and the Italian ruling class to get them back with the program, back on board, back into the standard left-right dance that Chomsky was talking about, are overwhelming and almost non-understandable. Because of these assumptions that color the way in which the news accounts of what's going on in Italy are formed. It's an interesting time.
I think Tariq Ali might have called that the radical center.
Radical center, that's what I was looking for.
Which is a kind of interesting play on words. In terms of radical, what he doesn't mean is radical in a traditionally leftist sense of the word, but radical in radical capitalism, a kind of radical neoliberalism. But just to be sort of devil's advocate a little bit here, to raise, I think, obvious questions that many people would raise and want the answer to, and we know you have the answer, right?
Of course.
So nationalist. So Nazism was nationalist socialism.
Yes.
And look what became of that. That didn't end well. But if I wanted to be provocative, about this, I would say that Zionism is also a form of national, at least in its origins.
Oh, sure.
Was a form of nationalist socialism. There were different aspects of Zionism in terms of how they envisioned settling Palestine and how the society would be organized. But what became to be the dominant view was that of what became the Labor Party, and that was a kind of nationalist socialism.
Yes, that's right.
And I guess the other thing you might like to respond to, interestingly, and we've talked about this before, you mentioned a lot of countries there, but two countries that you didn't mention were Hungary and Poland. So are you placing them in a different category in terms of the right wing or the nationalist or identity-oriented governments that have, or political parties that have emerged in Europe?
Yes, I think so.
In recent years.
I think what's happening there is quite different from the situation in Italy, and we can see that in regard to one great point that amazingly is not usually mentioned in the American press, and that's the relationship to Russia. Both Hungary and Poland are desperate for the support of the U.S. and EU in order to oppose what's seen as the influence of Russia. Both populist parties in Italy reject the EU and, well, less the EU, the U.S. Hostility to Russia and its demand to control the European economy. Both the populist parties of the right and left in Italy are insisting that the sanctions on Russia have to stop. In Hungary and Poland, they want the U.S. and EU sanctions on Russia to increase precisely because they think they'll profit from those sanctions. That's the real difference, and the fact that we have I think, quite a different situation, so much so that it's not quite right to call the ruling parties in Poland and Hungary populist in the sense that the Italian parties are.
Yeah. So,
let me say that one more way and see if I make sense of that. Hungary and Poland are very much concerned about U.S. patronage, and therefore they follow the U.S. line in hostility to Russia. Italy and so the Italian parties want to throw off that hostility to Russia and see their economic conjunction with Russia as being seriously retarded by what by U.S. policies in Europe. Hungary and Poland are with them. Italy and, I must say, other members of the EU are against them.
And just to sort of footnote that this general controversy, and maybe focus a little more on the Middle East, because this is a controversy about whether people on the so-called left and right, meaning the anti-war left and right, can cooperate with each other.
Yes.
And there was interesting. Diana Johnstone had an article on Consortium News in the last few days that that promoted this idea of the red-brown alliance. This idea
that's
that
going a little far, isn't it?
Whatever. Yeah, sure.
To say that she was promoting the red-brown alliance.
Well, she was promoting the idea that people could work together, and all of this stems from all of this fundamentally stems from an understanding of what's going on in Syria, not the Middle East at large, because I think a lot of people agree with that. They just don't agree about Syria. I'm not quite sure why. And I think what's interesting about Johnstone's article is that it appeared on Consortium News. I'm not sure what's read more, Counterpunch or Consortium News, but I think Diana Johnstone is. I think these comments were not. I could be wrong, and maybe you have some insight into this. I don't think her comments in response to another article, attacking, about Syria and what's going on there and whether the moderate rebels should be supported and all that kind of stuff. All this stuff that we've been talking about in this program for many months now. I'm not sure if that argument is particularly welcome at the Counterpunch website now, although Patrick Coburn is still being published there.
Oh, sure.
So anyway, this was published on Consortium News, and which I don't really read all that much. I know about it, and I have articles referred to me from there. But they also allowed the person that she was critical of, a guy named Tony McKenna, to respond to her. So, and they also allow comments. So you can go read both of those articles, lots of comments, and get an idea what the debates are regarding what's going on in Syria and what the left should be doing about Syria, because unfortunately, even in the midst of what's going on in Israel and Gaza and Yemen and so forth, they're still at it. When it comes to Syria, part of the left, meaning the ISO, the International Socialists, they're still at it.
This is a matter is complicated, both in the real world, where circumstances David referred to are the case, also complicated in the coterie world of people who write political blogs and whatnot. It's difficult because it draws on a complex history and contemporary personalities, we might say. The whole notion of a red-brown alliance is not something that people announce with praise. Hey, we have a red-brown alliance. It's a charge made by the enemies of certain parties that they are combining illegitimately left, and that's what the red suggests, and let's try to say that again. Here's the problem in having the terminology work for you rather than against you. A red-brown alliance is, in description, an alliance between communists and Nazis. red for the communists, brown for the Nazis. A red-brown alliance is not something people announce. It's a charge made by others against politics that you have, as it were, nefariously entered into in allying yourself either with communists or with Nazis, being one or the other yourself. Now, under those circumstances, the publication of Diana Johnstone's argument excoriating Counterpunch and some other publications for acquiescing in acquiescing in the views of leftist writers. I've turned it around and got it backwards myself.
Yeah.
Let me say what Johnstone charged Counterpunch, and it's no surprise to regular viewers of this program that we speak of Counterpunch as indeed they are friends of this ground, and the charge from Diana Johnstone is that Counterpunch is illegitimately charging other leftist writers with acquiescing in a red-brown alliance. I think in this particular case, for all that the Counterpunch people are our friends, that Johnstone has got it right. And that it's unfortunate, and I've said that to the editor of Counterpunch, and it's unfortunate that the editor of Counterpunch or that the editor of Counterpunch has seen it worthwhile to publish people who take this particular line. Counterpunch as a publication has always been, as I have said to them from the beginning, Catholic in its taste. Not uppercase C Catholic, but lowercase c Catholic. Jeffrey Sinclair, the editor of Counterpunch, has always published views that he didn't agree with, including pieces that you and I wrote. Not that we have a general disagreement. But what's happened now is that recently Counterpunch has gone after some people on the left, confusingly, another one named Johnstone, no relation to the first, who are accused by people writing in Counterpunch of acquiescing in a red-brown alliance by saying that rightists opposed to the war in the Middle East should be, to some extent, welcomed as comrades.
And let's be clear, supporting Assad is the total charge that's going on. That's the brown aspect of it. There isn't really anything else.
And in some ways this is not, I mean, look, most of the people who object to what the U.S. is doing in the Middle East, to the wars carried on in the Middle East by the Obama administration and now by the Trump administration, have no particular brief for President Assad of Syria. The Assad regime, the legitimate government of Syria with a seat at the UN and so forth and so on, has a wretched record in a lot of areas. So wretched that the American CIA once used the Assad government to torture people that the CIA wanted to torture. The Assad people did it for them. The CIA outsourced it to Assad. We have no brief for Assad when we claim the U.S. is carrying on an illegal and immoral war in Syria. But the matter has been so obfuscated, indeed in some ways on all sides, that we get this distressing internecine fight on the left between Diana Johnstone and the editors of Counterpunch. My personal view, for all my personal associations with these people, is that the editors at Counterpunch in this matter are more at fault, frankly.
And I would add to that regarding, there are other issues beside Assad, because the people who are arguing against this and accusing this whole red-brown thing and this whole anti-unipolar thing of going on, they're throwing in Iran. They're saying we're too soft on Iran. There are people on the left don't support the people of Iran in their struggle against the government, and they even throw Venezuela in there. So I think that at this point in time, when sanctions are really becoming a form of war, or are a form of war against Iran, against Venezuela, and of course against Gaza, that these people their arguments are looking, particularly threadbare in that larger context. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense to criticize people who support Iranian, who support a diplomatic approach to Iran or Venezuela, to sort of lump them all in as people that are these sort of Stalinist types who just don't understand how the global revolution is really going to work, how the global class struggle is really going to work. You can't have any truck with any of these governments admittedly, let's say, authoritarian governments in a place like Iran, but still democratically elected.
For Americans, the task is to recognize that for all the remarkable and conscious obfuscation of the matter that we get from the American government and from American mainstream media, what is fundamentally at stake are absolutely unjustifiable wars being carried on by the American government. And at this point, the American discussion is, well, is it Obama? Is it Trump? Is it the CIA? Is it somebody else? That's not the point. The American war making is consistent from administration to administration, and regardless of who happens to be this week's neocon bully in Washington. The crimes that the U.S. has committed in this century, beginning with the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, are legion, and the attempt to try to sort out the assignment of guilt within the American administration is useless because they're all guilty. Bloody Gina Haspel, appointed head of the CIA by Democrats in the Senate, by the way, indicates the universal aspect of American crimes in the Middle East. The attempt to resist the Trump administration, Trump being perhaps the weakest American president since Calvin Coolidge, is not to the point. The point is the wars that the U.S. are carrying on must be opposed, as much of the rest of the world recognizes, and instead we have the one enemy that the American government actually fears, the American public, constantly being misled about what that situation is.
And just to punctuate this historical continuity, what we had in the last week since the election in Venezuela was the New York Times calling for the overthrow of the Venezuelan government. The New York Times editorial board calling for, in a sense, as in Chile in 1973, right, just to draw that parallel, although you can draw many others, that's the most obvious one. In the year 2018, the New York Times is calling for the overthrow of a democratically elected Latin American government. It's unbelievable. It is really unbelievable. Oh, wait. It keeps going on, so it must be believable after all.
We have said that this was a King's Evil Advisors edition of News.
Oh yes, I wanted to get back to that.
News from Neptune.
And what did you mean by that?
There's certainly, well, yeah. I mean that the Pences, the Bolins, the Pompeos, who have come into the Trump administration, which after all was elected in part because of Trump's attacks on the war crimes of the earlier administrations, the Bush and Obama administrations, that the people who've come into that are the ones who are carrying out this ongoing American war policy. It's that ongoing American war policy that we need to talk about, we need to say something about, mainstream media doesn't do it, and oppose. I'm happy to see there are signs of it. Darling Nikki Haley, the UN representative, you like that, I know, is a...
You're gonna get it. We might have to pull you out for that one. Joe might have to go to the bullpen.
She was shouted down at a university talk the other day with people saying, "How dare she defend the crimes of the Israeli Defense Force in the sniper killings of unarmed protesters along the border?" I know, with Gaza. And look, that's good. We need 2-3 many Vietnams, as someone once said. We need more attacks on darling Nikki. You've been watching News from Neptune for the 21st week of 2018, presented by Carl Estabrook and David Green, produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Ethan Young and Andrew Scholarly, the last two of whom are having birthdays today. Happy birthday, gentlemen. Many happy returns. This has been a King's Evil Advisors edition of News from Neptune. Our thanks, as usual, to Research Director Dr. No. His notes are on the Facebook page for News from Neptune. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.